Okay, now comes the hard part in the Debunking Biblical Creationism series, and that is taking on moderate Christians. To use a metaphor to explain why, taking on fundamentalist Christians is like assaulting a fortress. Yes, they're dug in, but at least you know where they are, and now it's just a matter of breaking through their defenses and getting to them. But on the other hand, debating with moderate Christians is like guerrilla warfare. They're nowhere and they're everywhere all at the same time. Or to use a less violent sports analogy, they keep moving the goalposts around. But I'm going to give it my best shot. First of all, I would like to ask the question, if God really did speak to prophets and related to them a poetic account of how creation took place, what would we expect to find? Well, personally, I'd expect to find at least the right order of events. Day 1, God creates the fabric of space and time. Day 2, God creates the stars. Day 3, God creates the sun. Day 4, God creates the earth. At least then you could say, okay, the use of the word day is just metaphoric, and at least there's kind of the right order of events and so on, as opposed to what we actually have in Genesis chapter 1, which is creation of the sky dome, then creation of the plants, then creation of the sun. The order of events is completely wrong. Additionally, if it is true that when it says in chapter 1, verse 14 to 17, that Yahweh creates the sun, moon, and the stars and sticks them into the sky dome, that was just a metaphor, apparently nobody told his son Jesus. Jesus says, everyone please turn to Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. Jesus says, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken." So Jesus here literally believes that the moon gives off light, and that the stars are little lights in the sky dome that shall fall to the earth in the end times. A rather embarrassing error for the Son of God, I should think. Additionally, Genesis goes into some curious details here, and I'd like to thank Adam for pointing this one out to me. Genesis chapter 2, verse 10 through 14. It talks about specific places and rivers, like the river Euphrates, and places like Assyria and Ethiopia. And it's such that Christians can actually try to locate exactly where the Garden of Eden was supposed to be. Now, if the Garden of Eden was just supposed to be a metaphor symbolizing humanity's fall from innocence, then why was it necessary to put it in a specific place on this earth? Along the same lines, why was it necessary to go into great detail about the genealogy of Adam? How in Genesis chapter 5 it talks about how Adam begat Seth, and how Seth begat Enoch, and so on and so forth. Why was it necessary to go into details about genealogy? Especially since in ancient Hebrew culture, genealogy was such an important part of history. They wouldn't have gone into the genealogy of Adam unless they considered Adam to be a literal historical character. Also, when it comes to how long is a day to Yahweh, well, opinions vary on this point. The longest I've heard is the Jehovah's Witnesses, who consider a day to be 7,000 years. Now, what they base this on, I have absolutely no idea. But assuming that their beliefs are true, that we're in day 7 right now, that Yahweh is still resting, that means that the sun and the stars can't possibly be more than 28,000 years old. And that means that the Andromeda Galaxy, which is located 2 million plus light years away and is still visible in the night sky, that means that Yahweh must have created the light en route to Earth, which of course means that they feel comfortable serving a deceptive God. Tell you what, instead of arguing against the how long is a day thing using facts, I'm going to go ahead and use Scripture. Would everyone please turn to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11, and I'd like to thank King Heathen for pointing out this verse. Yahweh is explaining to Moses exactly why it is important to keep the Sabbath holy. He says in verse 11, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and that in them is, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." So essentially, Moses, one of the foremost prophets of the Old Testament, is relating that he heard it directly from Yahweh. It was a literal 6 days of creation. Now, the ancient Hebrews reading the Old Testament apparently did believe that it was all 6 days. So there's no reason to think that somehow a day was just being spoken in the metaphoric sense. Also, one other important point. is that the whole process of the fall from grace is very critical to Christian theology. There had to have been a fall from grace in the Garden of Eden in order for it to make sense that Jesus had to come to this earth to sacrifice himself to himself, because bleeding on a cross was the only way that he could convince himself to forgive us all. Because if the fall from grace only occurred in a metaphoric sense, then there really was no point for Jesus to come to earth and save us from something that didn't actually exist. Now, Paul seems to think that Adam was a literal person. If everyone will please turn to Romans chapter 5, verse 12. And he explains this whole process. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, he's talking about Adam, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. So Paul is making it clear that sin entered the world at the point where Adam and Eve had their fall from grace. Now, some moderate Christians I know will say that Adam and Eve were literal historical characters, but evolution is still true. That Adam and Eve were the first human beings to have souls, essentially, and that they're the ones who started this whole process, the fall from grace and the need for Jesus to come to this earth and save us all. But if that's the case, then how could evolution have happened if there was no death in the world? The entire process of evolution depends on the whole cycle of life and death. If there was no death, then there could have been no evolution. And therefore it's not possible to consider Adam and Eve to be literal historical characters, and yet evolution had been taking place prior to them. Next in the series, I'm going to talk about Satan, or sometimes a snake is just a snake.